Thank you, everyone. Oh, look at that. Quietest, most beautiful people in the world in here. Aren't they gorgeous? So local perspectives in truth in the telling. Academics, lawyers and individuals with the interest in truth and the Australian experience. So really looking forward to these three masterminds. I was just telling Dr. Robin that I've recently purchased her book, so I think it's one that we should all purchase and make some changes with, and you're going to share your story, but I might wrap it up with my story at the end about how wonderful I think that book is. And I will let Mr. Nigel Brown, as it says in here, Larrakia and Walnemand lawyer and CEO of Larrakia Development Corporation, introduce this amazing panel and their wisdom that they're going to share with us. Thank you very much, and please make him feel welcome.
Thank you, Shelley, and still morning, bookmark everybody. Truth in the telling. I do have the honour of introducing our speakers today, people who are experts in the legal landscape of the Northern Territory, the historic landscape of the Northern Territory, and the landscape of the Northern Territory. You've heard my English name, but I want to introduce myself in a different way. My name is Marapan Garamanak. I take Marapan from family in Ramangini, and Garamanak is my Larrakia family name. I also want to say in my grandmother's tongue, Niliak, Bachiganyam, Gangwa, Gwaelwa, Gumach. You've arrived. It's good to see you. This is Gumach country. Before I pass over and introduce our expert panel to you today, given the theme of truth-telling, I want to share just a little snippet of truth-telling from Larrakia country. 45 years ago, Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General of the Australian Government, was a junior solicitor at the Northern Land Council in 1979. That same year, the Kenby land claim was filed with the Federal Court. We took the government to the High Court twice during that time when the land claim was being disputed, and all Larrakia families gave evidence on their connection to country of the Cox Peninsula, some 680 square kilometres of land across from Darwin, across the harbour. In the year 2000, the Land Commissioner, Justice Gray, handed down his decision and recommendation to the then Minister, recommending that all of that 680 square kilometres of land be returned to Larrakia. In 2016, we had then Chief Minister Adam Giles, Indigenous Affairs Minister Senator Nigel Scullion, and Prime Minister Turnbull in front of the cameras, slapping each other on the back and getting happy snaps during the settlement of that land claim on the Cox Peninsula. My father was too sick to attend that ceremony, and Larrakia welcomed those politicians and other dignitaries to country on that day and was celebrating the settlement of the Kenby land claim. That was 2016. Fast forward to today, not one square inch of that 680 square kilometres of Larrakia country on the Cox Peninsula has been returned to Larrakia people. The treatment that we have received at the hands of successive territory governments and successive federal governments is absolute horseshit. Absolutely. But that's the world we live in. And that is the truth-telling that I wanted to share with you today, to let you know that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people across this country still put up with a system designed to keep them back, to hold them back. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. For us, it's 45 years of waiting. For government, it's Tuesday. Now, on with the main show. The first speaker I'd like to introduce to you this morning is a man well known in these parts, but indeed well known across the Northern Territory and across the nation. Mr. Bob Beadman is the former chair of the NT Grants Commission. He's worked in various locations throughout his long career, long public service, in Canberra, Brisbane and Darwin, serving both the Australian and Northern Territory governments. After 43 years of service, he retired in 2001, but he wasn't done just yet. He became the chair of the Northern Territory Grants Commission and has held numerous roles, including Coordinator General of Remote Services and Director of Cyclone Reconstruction, with a strong and distinct focus on Indigenous affairs. Recently, he wrote a piece that was published titled "Fighting Crime: Is the Law an Arse?" Mr. Beadman.
Thank you, Nigel. Given my bitter experiences at Garma, I think they've appointed him this time to keep me in control. I want to thank Yothuyindi, Garma, Dilak and traditional owners. And I want to continue on with the Larrakia theme a little bit by going back to the beginnings of the lodgement of the claim. The Land Rights Act simply says you can't claim land in a town. So the Northern Territory government's response was to incorporate the entire Cox Peninsula into the township of Darwin. It made Darwin 4 times greater than Greater London. And the absurdity of the action was obvious. So the Northern Land Council challenged that in the court and they won. And the Northern Territory government then challenged the Land Council's victory and it went all the way to the High Court. And the High Court said obviously the actions of the Northern Territory government were solely to thwart the land claim. So, notwithstanding that they've won the land claim, you've heard the ongoing history. I've written this paper recently called "The Law is an Ass." And its central principle was the national and international embarrassment about the rate of incarceration of Indigenous peoples for trivial offences that wouldn't result in incarceration in the States. Many on remand awaiting trial because of the dysfunction of the Northern Territory public prosecution and courts administration system. Many of the offenders are repeat offenders who offended while out on bail, so the police despair too. And it's a never-ending process. And we've now had several successive police commissioners say that you can't arrest your way out of this problem. The social issues go much deeper. And in recent months I've been trying to get a grasp on what those social issues are. And I've read a little bit, given the saturation coverage of American politics, which is another absurdity of the Australian system. I thought we had an Australian Broadcasting Commission, but it seems to me it's an American Broadcasting Commission. And I've tried to understand what the Trump phenomenon is. And that might assist me to understand what the phenomenon is in Australia. And I want to read you this little bit. It's from a black American, a noted author, James Baldwin, who's exiled himself to France, I think. One thing we know for certain is that the idea of America is inseparable from violence. It is a nation born in the genocide of the First Nations peoples of the continent and the slavery of millions of Africans. It won its freedom from Britain in war. It collapsed into civil war. It has seen political and civil rights leaders assassinated. It is a country where gun violence is commonplace. America has been a gangster nation. From the Gilded Age onwards, the country has been captured by corrupt robber barons. The law of the jungle is hidden between a normal Rockwell fantasy of small town manors, duck ponds, clock towers and soda schemes. America is a Ponzi scheme of elitist privilege masked by a cinematic gloss of equality, hope and freedom. I wonder whether it rings any bells. I wonder whether it triggers up the discussions about the haves and the have-nots, about closing the gap. So Baldwin reckons England stole America. Well, I reckon England stole Australia. And I reckon the evidence is very, very clear. That Cook was given orders to take possession of the continent in convenient situations in the country in the name of the king with the consent of the natives. And with his correspondence back to his superiors in England, he glossed over the fact that, and it goes on, if the country is uninhabited. So when he wrote back to England, he glossed over the fact that he hadn't sought consent. He glossed over the fact that the country was already inhabited. And consequently, Britain claimed the continent, and the absurdity of it leaves me speechless, but you won't believe that, will you? A mate of mine from the New South Wales coast, Arnhem, in the late 70s, got a possum skin cloak from somewhere, and he went to Dover and he hired a rowboat and he had the media all alerted, and he rowed 200 metres off the Dover coast, and when the media cameras were rolling, he rowed back on shore and planted a flag and claimed England for the Aborigines. And it just exemplified the absurdity of what Cook had done. So England then populated this country with convicts. Some of you have probably proudly got convicts as ancestors. And after they'd served their time, they've let them loose. And they've run riot right over the country while the law looked the other way, or the law participated in the dislodgement of the original occupants of the country, to poisoned waterholes, to massacres, to reserves. And I wondered why Robin and John and I were put in a group together, and it's pretty obvious, isn't it? She has just published a monument, and she'll tell you about it in due course, on massacres. And the story is horrendous. It's the whitewashing of Australian history. Here comes the truth-telling. Now, part of the humiliation that Aboriginal people suffered was reinforced to me in something that Yunupingu wrote for the monthly magazine, and bless them for publishing it, because it wouldn't have been fashionable in 2008. Listen to this. And it's got a bit to do with the High Court hearing in Darwin commencing Wednesday. Yunupingu. I step back to the 1950s. I am a small boy, maybe 8 years old, able to tell the difference between right and wrong. An event is to take place at Gulkula, about 30k up the road. Most of you will be aware. And members of the 13 clans are called together. Every man, woman and child is given clean clothes and dresses for the occasion. They come together with pretty flowers in their hands and dressed up cleanly. All are told to stand in line from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill to greet the chairman of the board of the Australian Synod of the Anglican Church, Methodist Church, sorry, Anglicans. And he arrives in a four-wheel drive with other people who jump out of their cars and are received by the local people. I remember this occasion perfectly well. We just stood there for show, dressed prettily, holding pretty flowers to give a so-called welcome to the Methodist Church. The vehicles come to rest, the dignitaries got out, they received their flowers and they smiled, and then they left and that was that. The clan leaders stood there expecting something that would acknowledge them and respect them. An exchange or a gift in return, but they received nothing. We were badly caught up that day and a poor example was set. Now it is the early 1960s and a man called Harry Geesey, the so-called protector of Aborigines in the Northern Territory, stands on a 44-gallon drum at the Yirrkala airport. He has called some people together to give them news. I am one of those people. My father is also there, Roy and Marmal and Marika, Japu leaders. A mine will be built here at Yirrkala, he tells us. It will mine the dirt that we stand on, our soil. The mining companies are coming and they will mine the land. They will take all the land and the boundary of the land will run to the edge of Yirrkala. And Yirrkala will be badly affected. Geesey talks for 20 minutes. Then he gets in his car and drives away. This is the first mining agreement on Aboriginal land. You view it through these days of land rights and native title and it's just obscenely disrespectful of the age-old people of this land. And I just marvel at that. And then we're told that the King is visiting in a few months. How wonderful is that? The King is visiting. Now, Professor Henry Reynolds, to his great credit, wrote in a publication called Pearls and Irritations on the question of whether the King will be asked to apologise. And he makes the point that revisionist historians are rewriting the history of the British Empire with a forensic vigour rarely seen before. The legacy of slavery is under critical interrogation in both Britain itself and erstwhile colonies. Respected institutions like the National Trust, the Anglican Church, venerable universities are being called to account for their historic involvement in the trade. The monarchy itself has come under fire. Britain's erstwhile West Indian colonies are... I won't go on. My point is, Aborigines grow up with this. You go on about the stolen generations. The jail populations that I've mentioned, and where we've arrived at, I think, is a desperate need to do things differently. And I've outlined a few things in the paper on Is the Law an Ass? And I just hope people take notice. There is a movement afoot called Justice Restoration in Sydney. I think it's chaired by a former Minister of Mine. It's got a board of former High Court judges, former state ministers, state attorneys general, state directors of prosecutions. It's the sort of body that's not going to be at the next demonstration on a street corner with placards. It's the sort of body that it seems to me that governments must pay attention to. Maybe the start of it is the Police Commissioner's apology yesterday. That was desperately needed. I don't know whether any of you have had the opportunity to see some of the transcripts from the inquest into the Yuendamu death that managed to access the police telephone text network. It is just appalling. You know, the apology was desperately needed. There will be lots of cynics about whether it would be carried through, but there was no alternative but to take that step. And he was brave enough to take it. Now the challenge is to carry the police force with him. But he's appointed Leanne Little. And if anybody is to drag the police to a more responsible attitude, it's he and her, I think. So that's it from me. I don't provide you with the solutions to the future. I provide you with, hopefully, a feel for the resentments in Aboriginal people to the developments of the last 200 years, which are not being relieved readily. I wrote another paper that was published too. I should just mention it, given the discussions yesterday about infrastructure deficit. It's been a bee in my bonnet for years, and Barry Hanson on the side wall there is another exponent, and Fred Chaney, and the three of us have often been here in the past about the morality of the GST sharing, which is supposedly cut on a needs-adjusted basis. Well, Morrison interfered with that, and he said each state now gets 75% of what was collected in that state, no strings attached, and the remaining 25% will be divided on a needs-adjusted basis. It's had a massive negative effect on the Northern Territory. It's had a massive positive effect on Western Australia. Western Australia got that boost because at the time their iron ore royalties had dropped. Since then they've had a massive boost in GST share and now iron ore royalties have not only the volume exported but the value has gone through the roof. So WA is the only state that's shown a surplus for the last half a dozen years. So I've tried to further expose that and deal with what's also seen as inappropriate expenditure by the Northern Territory government. The amount of GST share that the Northern Territory government gets is untied, which means that the Commonwealth has got no influence on how it allocates the money. And there's been an ongoing argument, no matter what stripe of government is in place, as to whether that loading that they get through thin population dispersed over a wide area finds its way to those remote corners, or where it's spent primarily in the northern suburbs of Darwin that return the most seats to the House of the Legislative Assembly, which will in turn determine government. Ongoing argument. So the paper was titled Bugger the Bush - the pauperisation of generations of people. Therein lies the answer to the infrastructure deficit in the Northern Territory. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Bob. Always a pleasure to hear you speak, and certainly with your well-researched and well-reasoned approach to the history and life of Territory, the Territory and its inhabitants. The next speaker here today is Dr. Robin Smith, historian and author of the recently published book, Licence to Kill: Massacre Men of Australia's North. I had a sneak peek of the book just earlier, and it's on my to-read list because it also is apart from the general history that I think everyone should be aware of, its particular interest to me is the fact that the place that has the most street names in the Territory is on Larrakia country, given we've got a capital city plonked on top of our traditional lands. And there are a lot of street names and place names on Larrakia country that simply shouldn't be there. We're not talking about erasing history. If you want to read about these people, pick up a book. But they shouldn't be memorialised. And in addition to the book published in June of this year, if you're also wanting to catch a snippet of Robin's work, she had an article published in The Guardian in February of this year. Australia would do well to have a chat about the truth of its history and stop memorialising monsters, which also makes for a good read. Robin is a lecturer in colonial history at Charles Darwin University. She provides a detailed examination of frontier violence in Australia's north, focusing, of course, on the Northern Territory. Her work exposes massacre perpetrators, their supporters, and how colonialism persisted through civic honours and place names. It offers a comprehensive analysis of complex dynamics of colonial expansion and, in 2024, its lasting impacts. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robin Smith.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Excuse me, I'll be turning so I can see my slides. I'm sorry about that. But they're my cue, so I need to see. Oh, that's me. Thank you to the Yothuyindifoundation for the invitation to be here on their beautiful country from beautiful Larrakia country. I'm not going to say whose country is more beautiful because they'll start scrapping. Massacre Men, the book that I have written, deals with Northern Australia, although it's predominantly the Northern Territory. And one of the reasons that I say it deals with Northern Australia is because it was the same traffic, the same people, the same colonisers going across and back. So we're talking from Queensland in through the Northern Territory across to the Kimberley and back again. Sometimes down south into Perth, into Adelaide, into Sydney and Melbourne. And there are places named after them everywhere. It's not just the Northern Territory, it's all over Australia. That's where they were, and those yellow dots represent individual massacres that we can prove with academic rigour in respect of 6 or more people being killed. So if you consider 5 people being killed a massacre, doesn't make the cut for that map. So just bear that in mind. But that was the academic rigour that was applied. So only massacres of that nature are on there. And only massacres that we can prove. So these are the dates that we're talking about in respect of the massacres and in respect of the whitefella imposed jurisdictions. 1859 for Queensland, 1862-ish for the Northern Territory, and the Kimberley area was gazetted in 1880. There were 2 catalysts for massacres in the NT. The first was the Overland Telegraph Line. Roughly, that's the route, and you can see that there's a time slider on the massacre map that if you use it, you can actually see that those massacres align with when the telegraph line went through, and then pastoralism from where it fanned out after that. And that's basically the pastoralism way with the stock routes that came across the Gulf country from Queensland, very violent across the Gulf area. That's an example of the stock routes. They are Nat Buchanan's droving tracks. Nat Buchanan, revered in Northern Territory pastoral history, perpetrator. average number of victims. This is an academic exercise. I don't do maths. I don't do this sort of stuff, but God bless Bill Pascoe who did. And you can see it's the highest for the north of Australia, which of course has the lowest population and most of the rest of Australia doesn't care about unless we're about to be invaded or someone digs a very big hole in the ground that's worth a lot of money. And there we are, 5% of the population, but a lot of the land. And it didn't end, our massacres map ends in 1930 because the conventional wisdom is that Coniston was the last one. No, that's not the case. I have examples from the 1930s and 40s, World War II, 1942, and an attempted massacre in Central Australia in 1981. 2 people died in that one, 14 were hospitalised. Attempted murder by person or persons unknown was the coronial result of that. So we're not talking Coniston as the last at all. In this year's Gama program, you'll see this from Mr. Jawa Yunupingu. That probably took place at a place called Mwangi, also variously known as either Florida Station or Arafura Station. And it was most likely perpetrated by a fellow named George Conway. He was employed as a mercenary on the station to ride around and mow down Aboriginal people. This didn't happen in isolation. Authorities knew about it. The South Australian Parliament knew about it. This was not people acting as rogue vigilantes. Conway Road is named after him. Equally, the perpetrator could have been a guy named Jack Watson, could have been Joe Bradshaw, or it could have been Billy Farrer. Places are named after all 3 of those. So if we can't nail George Conway for that one, there are others who can certainly go into the frame, and it will be one of them or their contemporaries. And this is all public information. You can find it on the place names register, but you won't find the dirty bits. It doesn't say that he is a mercenary in that entry. It says what a fabulous Territorian he was. And he married, funnily enough, he married Alice Farrer, who would have been, of course, related to Billy Farrer. This is from the Tiwi Islands, taken in about 1914. It references the Fort Dundas riot, which was about 1824. There's no way anyone in that photo was alive at the time, yet there they are, reenacting it. And what do they look like? What are they doing with those spears? That's what they're doing. That's a pretty accurate historical record. So are these. But traditionally they're not accepted as records because they're not written, and they're not written by a white fellow. But they're there. And these are just some examples of what happened. They weren't, as I said, not just in the Northern Territory, across the border into WA. My colleague Chris Owen, Chris did the WA research on the massacre map, And we often thought we had duplicated massacres when we hadn't. That they just rolled across the border. People paid no attention to the border, of course. And when pastoralists were pursuing people, they didn't care about the border. And you remember too, the Durex were related to the Bradshaws, and the Bradshaws were related to the Guns, and everyone had a friend in Parliament, and so it went on. There are records, Aboriginal records, of what happened. These are some examples of where you'll find them. You'll also find them in land claim reports. Here's, yes, Red Lily Lagoon, notorious on the Roper River, Elsie Station, we of the Never Never. There she is, Jeannie Gunn. This is a chapter that was in the original book that was excised when it was put into schools. So the Australian government censored the dirty bits from We of the Never Never. She took part, Jeannie Gunn took part in a massacre and wrote about it. And all of the guys, all of the characters in that book that she gave Irish Mac and all the nicknames to, they've all been identified, they've all been found, they've all been reinterred. They're down at Springvale Station now, it's a tourist attraction. They're all honoured. Most of them have places named after them. She certainly does. There we are, Red Lily Lagoon for a surprise party. Surprise party is one of many euphemisms for a massacre. Teach a lesson. The lesson was a stern one. The natives must be shown they can't get away. Educated, made quiet, disciplined. And here's the biggest secret of all, also known as, well, variously, but black velvet was a reference to Aboriginal women who were routinely abducted, raped and held for sexual slavery. This is a perpetrator from WA, Georgie Y. There was a guy running around in the Victoria River region whose name was Walter Y. Same spelling, I suspect siblings, I don't know. And there is a man from the from the VRD area who said if Walter Wallawai, old Wallawai, is what the Aboriginal people called him, if he didn't like you, he'd take a bullwhip to you, and if he really didn't like you, he'd shoot you. Anne McGrath wrote about it, Black Velvet. It was no secret. It appeared in newspapers. This is a reference to Darcy Ure and his then business partner, Mitchell Dare Armstrong. They had a butchering business on the Pine Creek goldfields. Ted Egan wrote about it in The Drover's Boy. There's a painting from the Art Gallery of WA. And all these perpetrators are honoured in place names. Charles Todd from the Overland Telegraph, he was the Postmaster General in South Australia. He wasn't immune. He authorised massacres, or at least turned a blind eye. They're all the places, or some of the places, that are named after him. There's Inspector Falsh from the police. He was a bit of a split personality. He had one persona in public and quite another one in private. Nat Buchanan, pastoralist, revered. He was a perpetrator. Jeannie Gunn. There was a police officer named Erwin Wurmbrandt, not spelt either of those ways, but both of those place names are named for him after the 1884 Anna's Reservoir reprisal massacre. That is the only image I have ever found of him. Reputedly an Austrian archduke. So, sorry, that was a very quick and dirty version of truth-telling, but it's not about truth-telling, because if you speak to Aboriginal people, they'll tell you that they have been telling the truth ever since this stuff happened. The problem is with the listening. And these aren't my words, Aboriginal women in particular have said this is not about truth-telling, this is about truth listening. So maybe it's time to listen to them. Oh, sorry, that's just a plug. Thank you.
We're just getting a lectern for Mr. Lawrence. It's a proven fact that lawyers can't talk without a lectern in front of them.
That is very heavy.
I can say that I used to be one.
You're a lawyer.
I've moved on. Thank you, Dr. Smith. I think there's no doubt that the content of Robin's research is very heavy. It certainly weighs very heavy on my soul, and no doubt everybody in this room. It shouldn't come as a surprise that this is the history of the Northern Territory, part of the history of the Northern Territory. But for a lot of people it is, and it was the same all over the countryside, not just here, of course. And of course it wouldn't be such a surprise if the education curriculum in Australia actually taught the real history of this country, which hopefully one day, if we're all serious about truth-telling, will happen, and our children will learn the black and the white history of this nation. And I think it can only help, to not only open our eyes collectively, but also open our hearts, which a lot of people seem to have closed in 2024. And I'd just like to make a comment too in relation to Inspector Falsh. It does my head in that bloke has a street name named after him in Darwin CBD. He was an absolute monster. Took a lot of lovely photos, but also is responsible for the murders of more Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory than anyone else. And he's commemorated by the NT Police. And I think as recently as 2020 or thereabouts, in one of the police magazines, he was written about as being a pioneer in the Territory. To my mind, that sort of whitewashing of our history is plainly and absurdly wrong. So thank you again, Dr. Smith. All right, coming home with a wet sail. Mr. John Lawrence, SC, former president of the NT Bar Association, a Darwin barrister and former Crown prosecutor, something we have in common. But during my time in the courtroom, I was on the other end of the bar table to Mr. Lawrence, and he always presented as a person concerned with the rights of others, particularly those who found themselves in the unfortunate grasp of the criminal justice system. He served as solicitor in charge of the then Northern Australia Aboriginal Legal Aid Service, and of course is the past president of the Northern Territory Bar Association and the Criminal Lawyers Association of the Northern Territory. He has also represented one of the Dondale youth detainees during the Royal Commission. He has a Scots law degree and an Australian law degree, which has armed him with the necessary skills to be a fierce advocate for many in the Northern Territory. And he obtained Silk in 2011 and has been a fixture on the legal landscape of the Northern Territory for many, many years. He has a strong connection with this part of the world, this beautiful part of the world, and has represented quite a number of Yolngu across the years, including Mrs. B. Marika, Mr. D. Guruwiwi, Reverend Gondara, Mr. Yunipingu, and a then young Mishak Yunipingu, involved in a case of serious police misconduct, which resulted in a formal apology from the Northern Territory Police at Elcho Island in the presence of some 400 Yolngu people. There is no doubt that John and the work that he has placed into the legal sphere in the Northern Territory can be denied, and we look forward to hearing from you today.
Thanks, Nigel. Can I pay my respects to the custodians to this land, the elders past, present and emerging. Nigel mentioned my relationship with the people of this land, which has been long-standing and at times very close. I was not only a representative of Mr. Yunipingu, but I considered a friend. Similarly, Dr. B. Marika, a great artist, and Mr. D. Guruwiwi, and I spent lots of time with them over here, learning from them on Indigenous customary law, which was fascinating, enlightening, and a great bonus for me as a man and as a lawyer. I'm also very honoured to be invited by those people from here to give what I consider today, if I can put it this way, my evidence on the justice, injustice situation experienced by Aboriginal people. And so I'm looking upon this, when I prepared it, as a witness statement. I'm not of this country, as you can clearly hear. I'm not of this land, as you can clearly hear and see. But I've been working in the territory legal system and some others in Australia for over 37 years. So I know it intimately. And in that period, which literally takes us from 1987 to today, I've seen it deteriorate. And when you're a lawyer or a barrister, it's not a 9-to-5 job. So I've lived in this legal system and seen it close up and seen it deteriorate. It's cold shower time, and cold shower is necessary if we're fair income about telling the truth. Because truth-telling is just two words. It's Whether we mean it, whether we listen, is the point. We live in a period of history now where we're engulfed in words, 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 but very little action, action, action. And from my perspective, we've replaced the necessary action with words. The situation now, in my opinion, as an expert witness in this statement, is that it's an emergency. It's a catastrophe. It's a situation of life and death. That's truth-telling. And it wasn't life and death 37 years ago, which is amazing to think that a country as rich as this, and who said so many things about reconciliation during that period, has actually deteriorated. That speaks volumes. That's the truth. Here's something out of the legal world that sheets home the emergency and the life and death situation that this country's in, and that we should all be aware of. Acute rheumatic fever, the health situation. Rheumatic heart disease flows from it. It's the ultimate disease of disadvantage, and yet it's totally preventable. There is no cure for it if you cop it. You die. You die young. Your heart fails at 40 instead of 60, 70, 80. You get it from infections rife in overcrowded housing. Dickensian England, the Northern Territory, Aboriginal lands. 57% of the disease is in the Northern Territory. 57%. It's a third world disease. And here's the real statistic. Per head of population per 100,000, in New South Wales, it's 1.3. In Western Australia, which is the next highest, is 69.5. Here in the Northern Territory, it's 359. It's a killer. It's more important than anything else in Australia, in my humble opinion. It's preventable. We know it's preventable, and we've failed to prevent it. That's the reality. That's truth-telling. That's the cold shower. I'll go back to the law. My evidence that I present to you and countrymen out here is on recent history. It's been great listening to Bob and Robin present a more longer history. Great's not the right word. Sad and horrible, really. That last talk was just mind-blowing. But history is everything, at least in the way I was brought up in Scotland. And what's happened here, it's got worse. The failure is abject and shameful. And throughout the period of it deteriorating, many, many Aboriginal people have suffered, families, and they've died and they've grieved because of our failure in addressing and rectifying clear problems. The jails, this is my bread and butter, prison, the penal colony. The jails are overcrowded today. Prisoners are sleeping in the reception area of the prison. Prisoners are sleeping in police watch houses in the suburbs. But what's happened, and this is in a way the perennial problem, and it's happened in the 37 years because I've witnessed it, is we've all become normalized to it. It doesn't shock us at all or enough. It's just another day at the office. You should see the courthouses in this territory. I'm brought up as a lawyer. I know about the rule of law. I know about the separation of powers. I know about due process. There is no due process, none, in Northern Territory courts for Aboriginal people. None. It's a hoax, and it's a disgrace. And I walk into that court every day, and I think it's a disgrace, and I think it's a hoax, and I think it's a pantomime, and I can't believe it. And I get angry, and I get grumpy and obnoxious, and I'm glad I'm angry, because I should be angry. But nobody else seems to be that angry. All the younger lawyers, and I'm not being critical of them, I'm just analyzing critically what I'm observing here. The younger lawyers seem to think it's the norm, which is a fatal situation to be in. And that's where we are now. The system is broken. I've watched it break. It's a harvest of neglect. And this is what happens. These things happen incrementally, with little small steps, which is in fact a drift into totalitarianism. Human rights are stripped. Due process is gone. Nobody seems to be that bothered about it. And the jails are overflowing. The system is broken. And I look at everything. I look at health. I look at education. I look at government. I look at our apparent democracy. And they're all broken as well. Broken. They don't work. Democracy doesn't serve our interests anymore. It used to. It doesn't anymore. It's not functioning. The health system in the territory, I've just taken you to rheumatic heart disease, but there's dialysis, there's the life expectancy thing for Aboriginal people in this country. It's just beyond the pale. And it's been like that forever. And it can be fixed. And we can fix it. But we don't. We haven't. Words. 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 We heard them yesterday from the Prime Minister of Australia. He says, we must not go backwards. Where has he been? Where does he live? I live here. And it's gone backwards to the nth degree. And he says, oh, we must not go. Words. Baloney. To quote Professor Stana, I listened to him yesterday, and it was a fog of nothingness. And of course, we all get up and applaud him and kid ourselves on that, maybe this is it. And Murphy gives yet another apology on behalf of the police for Tom, Dick, and Harry, whatever it was. I mean, I understand how people require an apology for therapeutic reasons. I understand that. And it's not given to me. I understand that. But if I had my way, the sorry word would be excised from the Oxford English Dictionary. It means nothing. And it means nothing now because of the politicians who have abused it and exploited it. That's what the police were doing yesterday. I know what to do to get out of this jam. I'll get up and do an apology, which may have been good for the people that was addressed to, and so be it. But it doesn't wash with me. I mean, the levels of racism in that police force now, compared with when I joined the legal system as a Crown prosecutor and worked hand in glove with police officers, compared with then, is monumental. It was nowhere near what it is now back then. That is my evidence. I can't and I won't repeat the words that were used by the police as revealed and discovered in the coronial inquest. But that's racism to the power 10. And Commissioner Murphy turns up yesterday with the media, who are all part of the same circus. They're all part of the same narrative. They're getting the stories, and they're glossing it as if it's something positive, because apparently that's what we like hearing. Well, I like hearing the truth, crap as it is. And to turn up and give an apology for that, reference to other things like the intervention and so forth, this is what you do when you discover that level of racism in your police force. It's very easy, very easy. You fire the lot of them. You sack them. You get each cop that was coming out with that filth and you show them the door. What's difficult about that? How can you not do that? But the same Commissioner Murphy did no such thing. So that's why I'm, to put it mildly, cynical about the fog of nothingness that he produced yesterday as well. Truth-telling. Let's do it. Let's really do it. Let's stop kidding ourselves on. Let's stop taking the blue pill and take the red pill. Because if you keep taking the blue pill and kidding yourself on that there's positives here and positives there and all this sort of stuff, you're missing the point. The red pill is the rheumatic heart disease. The red pill is Don Dale Detention Centre. The red pill is the level of imprisonment, which is getting worse and worse. That's the only thing that counts. I want to talk about Don Dale.
That's a surprise.
Apparently, I learned today that it's the International Day of Indigenous Children. Well, sorry to put a damper on that, because as we speak and think fondly of Indigenous children, there are 43 of them in Don Dale Detention Centre right now. And Don Dale Detention Centre now is the converted or reopened Berrima Adult Prison. Let me just give you the narrative. Don Dale Detention Centre was built, number one, in 1990. And it was built as a custom-built facility for youths. It had rooms, not cells. It had classrooms. It had basketball courts. It had space areas. It was a youth detention centre, an appropriate one. That was shut down in 2014 because there was a war going on inside there, which was eventually revealed by Four Corners. And the war was between thug guards and the Aboriginal kids that were in there. and atrocities and cruelty were being committed by thug guards against these kids. And these kids, God bless them, fought back. They actually are, from my evidence, the only ones that fight back. The kids. They're the only ones that resist. They're the only ones that struggle. They're the only ones that say no. They're the only ones that dissent. The adults have lost the plot, including their own representatives. This is an age of sellouts. This is an age of hypocrisy. This is truth-telling. Dondale 2 was 2014. The CLP minister, John Elfrink, decided, well, if you're going to play up in Dondale 1, we'll move you out. We'll reopen the condemned Berrima prison for adult men, which is destined for a bulldozer. We'll reopen that, and we'll put you kids in there. That'll teach you a lesson. So they went in there in 2014. That's 10 years ago, just about. They're still there. And where they are is a converted adult male jail. The kids 10 and 11 years old are placed and living now in cells 3x3 with a wash hand basin and not much else, that were previously occupied by killers, rapists, pedophiles. And we've got kids in there that are suffering from all kinds of trauma, which has led them to sometimes flee their home, get in with bad company, commit offenses. They're black. Within 20 minutes, they're in jail. The prison the juvenile population is 100% black. 100%. The adult is 86%. That's disgraceful. 100%. 70% of these children are on remand. Can you imagine the deleterious effect putting a young child with all kinds of trauma conditions in a place like that? We are destroying them. We're doing it. The Prime Minister of Australia knows it, because I personally bailed him up about 2 years ago with some Aboriginal ladies in the Close Dondale movement. And we says, hey, look at this. Plus, you've got the constitutional authority over the Northern Territory. You can pass a bill tomorrow, 4 clauses. No more Dondale. Dondale is closed. There'll be no more children placed in that facility. But he not interested. It's a state issue. Blah, blah, blah. Fog of nothingness. That's why democracy is not working. It's not serving our interests. Education, catastrophe. Catastrophe. Much worse now than it was then. My wife is English as a second language school teacher, and she lived and worked on Snake Bay, Millicapity, Melville Island, Tiwi for 3 years. And when I first met her, I asked her to tell me, how does it work? And she says to me then, 1982, she says, well, what I'm doing is I'm teaching English as a second language, and we've got a bilingual course, which is really good, which really helps. And we've got a team of Aboriginal TAs that I teach them as well as the kids. And then in a couple of years' time, I leave, they take over. Brilliant, I thought. Brilliant it is. We've got rid of it. Governments have defunded it. too expensive, or maybe, because I'm an analytical son of a bitch, maybe it's convenient for the establishment to just keep the status quo going. Keep them uneducated, dumb them down. And it even confirms terra nullius, which was based on they're subhuman. We told you so. All these kids that are flying at the pub and Todd Tavern like spears and going mad and there's curfews and all that. I'd put my house on, none of them can read and write. The education system in the territory in the last 3 years has just gone off the charts. It's hopeless. It's failed. And there's no reason for that. There's no good reason. This is the richest country in the world. It could be solved, but maybe the cynic in me, the analytical in me is thinking, well, maybe we don't want Aboriginals educated. Maybe we want them dysfunctional. And then we can all go to court and we can be a prison officer and we can be a police officer and the status quo goes. This is happening, in my opinion. Can you imagine if we fixed this up? There'd be a lot of white fellas out at work. So, the jail levels are ridiculous and worsening. They're obscene. That suggestion I just made is a bit like Denise on the O'Mallow, the kid in the O'Mallow town, where we just have them like that. But Dondale is sick. It's really sick. Four Corners revealed torture, cruelty, spit hoods, isolation, ordering kids to eat bird shit and filming it and then sending it out into the cyber world, mental abuse, guards that were thugs. None of this could ever happen to white children. I mean, this evidence is compelling, is it not? Okay. Petrol sniffing could never happen with white kids. It would be eradicated in 20 minutes. It wouldn't be allowed. But it's allowed in this country, the history of which we've just heard. It's obscene. Note the time, so I better come to an end, but needless to say, in Dondale, there are countless incidents of self-harm. Again, you could put your house on, inevitably one day there's going to be a suicide. I represented a kid in there. This is the old prison. He was 12. He suffered from all kinds of mental difficulties because of a trauma household where both his parents were drug addicts and violent, which he witnessed. And they were both going to jail at different times, and Dad would take him to visit Mum in prison, and Mum would take him to visit. So this poor kid drifts, and he gets into trouble. And he's Aboriginal. So there's no protections, there's no safeguard, there's no bloody due process. He's got Aboriginal legal aid running around, doing very little. And that's the truth. That's the truth. Aboriginal legal aid is riddled with incompetence, not so much the professionals, but the way it's run is just disgrace. And yet somehow it's a sacred cow. Well, that's not on in my book, because all I care about are the kids that are out there who haven't got a lawyer, and they don't know when their court case is, and they don't know what they're charged with. All I'm worried about is the kids. I'm not worried about sacred cows and the basis of sacred cows, because it pales into insignificance compared with cruelty to children. There is no more precious thing in anybody's village wherever you are, Brazil, Iceland, Japan, than children. They're diamonds. And they deserve and get in the human cycle love and protection as much as possible. And yet we live in a country where we don't give a tinker's cuss about kids, certainly Aboriginal kids. Look at these children refugees. I've did a lot of cases with the refugees. 5-year-old Iranian girl locked up on Nauru. It's a concentration camp. Driven into mental illness, terrified, tortured. We did it. We all did it. I'll tell you why we all did it. Because most of us either vote Liberal or Labour. Both parties are up for it. Both parties agree with it. They reflect us. That's a disgrace. But that's Australia, 2024. A serious lack of care. It's all about me. Me, myself, I. Individualization. That's the revolution that's happened in the last 30 years. And it will be our undoing. It will be our undoing. The other thing that Aboriginal people are subjected to, and of course I can't really talk about it because I'm not subjected to it, but I know what it's about because I read books, is racism. Racism in this country. And look, my evidence is obviously influenced by the fact that I have no antecedents in this country at all. I came here when I was 22, fully forged as a young man, fully forged in Scotland. All my antecedents going as far back as I can work out are Scottish. I've got naught to do with this country. And so I'm from the Northern Hemisphere, I'm from Europe, I'm from Scotland. And I know about racism. My dad fought in the Second World War. They call it the Good War because it was the good guys against the fascists, the racists. And I remember asking my dad, who taught me about racism. I learned about racism from my father and my mother. Why did you sign up? Why did you conscript in the war? Because he didn't have to. He worked in the shipyards, which was a protected occupation. He says, well, we had to stop Hitler, which makes sense. But he also says, and we knew what they were doing to the Jews. And of course, not only did they know what they were doing to the Jews, but when they started opening up the concentration camps, of which my uncle was one of the British Army that opened up Belsen concentration camp, they discovered what racism is, where it leads to. So my parents, along with that whole generation, directed, taught, advised my generation about the evil that racism is. And I remember he said to me, he says, if you ever see racism, whether it's at the bus stop, school, playground, eradicate it, which was a license to do something which was improper in a way. But that's the horror that racism is. Now, 37 years later, it's out of control. So that's my truth-telling. Obviously, everybody's it begs the question, well, what can we do? 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 It's funny, a lot of people ask me that when I'm boring them to death with this kind of stuff, because they sort of agree with it and they want to fix it. So what can you do? What can we do? And, I mentioned earlier a harvest of neglect. There might not be anything we can do. We might have broke it. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. I think, along, funnily enough, with the young new ladies, that we are in right now, although it's hard to see sitting here, we are in collapse. That's what's happening now. In the Soviet Union in 1989, if you remember, history again, being instructive. Everything was forever until it was no more. That's what Russia was. And then one day it just fell over. It collapsed. So there's no amelioration of this, in my opinion, now. We've broken it. None of this fogs of nothingness that politicians keep turning up and keep injecting blue pills into Australians is going to work. We're going to collapse. And like the young new ladies, I don't mind. I'm sick of this. I'm serious. I'm sick of participating in this crap. I'm a lawyer of 37 years, a senior lawman who believes in it, and it doesn't happen anymore. So I'm angry, and the sooner it collapses, as far as I'm concerned, the better. And then, upon the rubble, we will build, or as the young new ladies say, the burning happens, and then it's regrowth. And you just got to learn how we effed up, and therefore we cannot do that again. That's my evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you walked in here not understanding the current state of play in the territory, hopefully now you have a better idea. If you didn't appreciate the history of this place and the perpetrators of massacres, from police to pastoralists and, for heaven's sake, postmasters, now you do. And I told you all that we'd be coming home with a wet sail. And I thank Mr. Lawrence for his forceful and learned presentation to you all here today. Just finishing up, I'd like to once again pay our respects to Jawa Yunipingu and the Gumatj clan for having us on their land, and for the Yolngu people, our brothers and sisters from across the territory, for allowing all of us to visit this beautiful place. And hopefully, this session, which now leads into lunch, allows you to take a message with you, not only in a territory context, but from wherever you are, to learn that old trite saying that you got to know where you come from to know where you're going. So thank you all for attending today.